Welcome to the dark and mysterious world of medieval mental health, a time when science was limited, superstition ruled, and understanding of the mind was as foggy as a winter morning in a dense forest. In an era where life itself was a daily struggle, how did people understand and treat conditions like depression, anxiety, or schizophrenia? Join us as we explore the bizarre, sometimes horrifying, and occasionally surprisingly effective methods used by medieval doctors to heal the mind. Imagine living in a world where your every thought, mood swing, or unusual behavior could be seen as a sign of demonic possession, divine punishment, or even witchcraft. Mental illness wasn't just a medical condition. It was often viewed as a moral failing or a spiritual battle. And yet, despite these misconceptions, medieval society developed some intriguing, and at times shocking, approaches to treating the mentally ill. From bloodletting to exorcisms, from herbal remedies to physical restraints, the methods used to address mental health issues were as varied as they were extreme. Some treatments seem barbaric today, while others hint at a surprising level of insight into human psychology. But one thing is certain: surviving mental illness in the Middle Ages required resilience, faith, and perhaps a bit of luck. So, buckle up for a journey through history's darkest corners. We'll uncover the strange beliefs, harsh realities, and occasional sparks of brilliance that defined medieval approaches to mental health. By the end, you'll have a new appreciation for both the challenges faced by those who came before us and the progress we've made since then. In the Middle Ages, mental illness was not seen as a medical condition to be treated with compassion or understanding. It was often viewed as a spiritual battle, a punishment from God, or the result of an imbalance in the body's mysterious forces. Unlike today, where we understand depression, anxiety, and psychosis through psychology and neuroscience, medieval people had no such framework. Instead, they relied on a mix of ancient Greek philosophy, Christian theology, and superstition to explain why someone might hear voices, behave strangely, or fall into despair. One of the most influential ideas came from Hippocrates and Galen, the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. According to this belief, good health depended on keeping these bodily fluids in balance. If one humor became too strong, it could affect both the body and the mind. A person showing signs of melancholy, for example, was thought to have too much black bile. Someone overly aggressive might have an excess of yellow bile. But beyond the humors, religion played a huge role. The church taught that madness could be a sign of divine punishment or demonic possession. People who acted unpredictably were sometimes believed to be witches or heretics. Others were seen as holy fools, individuals chosen by God to suffer for their faith. This confusion meant that treatment varied wildly. Some people were cared for within monasteries, where monks prayed over them and tried to offer comfort. Others were locked away, beaten, or even executed. There was no standard diagnosis, no known cause, and certainly no cure. The lack of scientific knowledge made every symptom a mystery. Hallucinations? Clearly demons. Depression? Probably a punishment for sin. Panic attacks? Maybe the wrath of an angry saint. It's easy to look back and judge these beliefs as primitive. But in a world without microscopes, psychiatrists, or even basic anatomy, how else could people make sense of something as complex as the human mind? As we move forward, we'll explore one of the most common treatments used to fix these imbalances: bloodletting. The foundation of medieval medicine, both physical and mental, rested on a theory that had survived for over 1,000 years. The humoral theory, first proposed by Hippocrates and later expanded by Galen. At its core, this theory suggested that the human body contained four basic fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was believed to come from keeping these humors in perfect balance. If one became too dominant, it could lead to illness, both of the body and the mind. Blood was associated with air and warmth. A person with too much blood was thought to be overly optimistic, passionate, or even manic. Phlegm, linked to water and cold, caused sluggishness and emotional numbness when in excess. Black bile was tied to melancholy. Too much of it meant depression, anxiety, and despair. Yellow bile, hot and dry, led to anger, irritability, and aggression. This belief shaped how doctors diagnosed and treated patients. Someone who seemed withdrawn, anxious, or suicidal wasn't seen as suffering from depression. They were said to have an excess of black bile. A soldier who returned from war angry and violent wasn't considered traumatized. He was suffering from an imbalance of yellow bile. Treatments aimed to restore balance through methods like bloodletting, purging, sweating, and induced vomiting. If you were too cheerful, they might try to reduce your blood levels to calm you down. If you were too sad, they might prescribe something warming to burn off excess black bile. Some treatments were based on astrology. Doctors would consult the stars to determine the best time to perform a procedure. A person born under a watery sign might need more drying treatments, while someone under a fiery sign might need cooling remedies. Despite being completely wrong by today's standards, the humoral theory dominated medical thinking for centuries. It was deeply intertwined with religious beliefs and natural philosophy, making it difficult to challenge. Monks and scholars wrote entire treatises on balancing the humors, and physicians spent years studying how to diagnose imbalances based on symptoms like complexion, pulse, and urine color. Some even used elaborate charts to map out which organs produced which humors and how they interacted. But perhaps the most dangerous consequence of this theory was that it discouraged innovation. If all illness was just an imbalance of fluids, there was little incentive to look deeper into anatomy, psychology, or biology. Why search for germs or neurotransmitters when the answer was already known? As we move forward, we'll take a closer look at one of the most feared and widely used treatments based on this theory: bloodletting. If there was one treatment that could be used for everything in the Middle Ages, from headaches to madness, from fevers to broken hearts, it was bloodletting. The idea was simple. If illness came from an imbalance of the four humors, then removing some blood would help restore balance. Blood was seen as the most volatile humor. Too much of it meant excitement, mania, or inflammation. So doctors believed the solution was obvious: cut open a vein and drain the excess. This practice wasn't just reserved for serious illnesses. If you were too cheerful, too sad, too angry, or simply not feeling well, a doctor might suggest bloodletting. It was the medieval equivalent of taking 2 aspirin and calling it a day, but with knives involved. Bloodletting was performed in various ways. The most common method was venesection, where a barber surgeon would use a sharp blade to slice into a vein, often on the arm or forehead, and let the blood flow into a bowl. Another method involved using lancets, small, razor-sharp tools designed specifically for making precise incisions. But perhaps the most famous form of bloodletting involved leeches. These slimy little helpers were placed on the skin to suck out what doctors called bad blood. Some treatments required dozens of leeches at once, applied to different parts of the body, depending on the ailment. Doctors followed detailed charts showing which veins corresponded to which organs and diseases. A person suffering from headaches might have blood drawn from the temples. Someone with digestive issues might have veins near the stomach targeted. And for mental illness, particularly conditions like melancholy or mania, bloodletting was often the first line of defense. There are records of patients undergoing repeated bloodletting sessions over weeks or even months. Some survived with minimal harm. Others weakened rapidly, becoming dizzy, pale, and dangerously anemic. In extreme cases, people died from excessive blood loss. Despite its risks, bloodletting remained popular for centuries. It was backed by both ancient medical texts and the Church, which saw no reason to question its effectiveness. After all, if the body was made up of 4 humors and disease was caused by their imbalance, then draining blood had to work, right? Some doctors took it to absurd extremes. One 12th century text recommended bleeding a patient until they fainted, believing this showed the treatment had reached the source of the problem. Another suggested repeating the procedure every few days until symptoms improved or until the patient couldn't stand anymore. Even royalty wasn't spared. King Charles VI of France, who suffered from bouts of psychosis and delusions, underwent frequent bloodletting sessions throughout his life. Whether it helped him is unknown. What we do know is that he spent years convinced he was made of glass and might shatter at any moment. As brutal as it sounds, bloodletting wasn't always completely ineffective. In rare cases, such as treating hemochromatosis or polycythemia, where the body produces too much blood, it could actually help. But for most conditions, especially mental ones, it did more harm than good. Now that we've explored how medieval doctors try to heal the mind by draining the body, let's take a closer look at another bizarre but surprisingly widespread technique: using leeches and suction cups. Before leeches became a symbol of outdated medicine, they were considered one of the most advanced tools in a medieval physician's kit. Bloodletting with knives and lancets was effective, but messy, painful, and sometimes dangerous. Enter the humble leech. These blood-sucking worms weren't just a creepy alternative. They were seen as a more refined, controlled way to remove bad blood from the body. Medieval doctors believed that certain diseases were caused by an overabundance of particular humors, especially black bile, which was linked to melancholy and madness. To restore balance, they turned to leeches, placing them on specific areas of the body, depending on the patient's condition. A typical session could involve dozens of leeches at once. They were often placed on the forehead or neck when treating mental illness, as these areas were thought to be closely connected to the brain. Once applied, the leeches would latch onto the skin and begin feeding, using their natural anticoagulant, hirutin, to keep the blood flowing. The process was slow but less traumatic than slicing open a vein. Patients didn't scream or bleed out into a bowl. Instead, they watched silently as small, wriggling creatures attached themselves to their flesh. Some found it soothing. Others fainted at the sight. But leeches weren't the only method used to draw out bad fluids. Another popular technique involves suction cups, also known as cupping therapy. This method had been practiced for centuries in ancient China and Greece before making its way into European medicine. Here's how it worked. A glass or wooden cup was heated, creating a vacuum when placed on the skin. The suction pulled blood toward the surface, supposedly drawing out toxins and impurities. Sometimes, tiny cuts were made before applying the cups to allow actual blood to flow out, an even more dramatic version of the same principle. Cupping was used for everything from headaches to hysteria. If someone was suffering from what we might now call depression or anxiety, doctors believed this treatment could help purge the poisoned parts of the body. It was especially favored for treating those who exhibited signs of nervousness, irritability, or emotional distress. These techniques weren't always ineffective. In some cases, removing small amounts of blood may have helped people feel better temporarily, possibly due to a placebo effect or simply because it offered a break from the stress of being ill. However, like many medieval treatments, there was no scientific basis for determining how many leeches to use or where to place the cups. Decisions were based largely on tradition, superstition, and guesswork. Despite their widespread use, not everyone trusted these methods. Some patients refused to let leeches anywhere near them. Others grew addicted to the ritual, believing they needed repeated sessions to stay healthy. In the end, both leeches and suction cups were symptoms of a larger problem. Medieval medicine had no real understanding of how the human body worked. But with few alternatives in a society deeply rooted in tradition, people had little choice but to trust the experts, even if it meant letting parasites feed on them or enduring strange vacuum marks on their skin. Now that we've explored these unusual forms of blood-based healing, let's move on to another bizarre but surprisingly common approach: herbal remedies and natural cures. While bloodletting and leeches dominated the world of medieval medicine, not every treatment was rooted in draining fluids from the body. In fact, some of the most intriguing and, at times surprisingly effective, methods involved herbal remedies. Monks, apothecaries, and village healers spent centuries compiling knowledge about plants, roots, and natural substances that could soothe pain, calm nerves, or even alter the mind. Unlike today's pharmaceutical industry, where drugs are tested, refined, and regulated, medieval herbalism relied on tradition, observation, and a heavy dose of superstition. Some treatments were based on ancient texts like those of Dioscorides or Pliny the Elder. Others came from folk wisdom passed down through generations. For mental illness, herbs were often used to either purge the body of evil humors or to provide comfort in ways we now recognize as mild sedation or mood regulation. One of the most commonly used plants was St. John's wort, known for its yellow flowers and believed to have protective powers against demons. Today, it's still used in some alternative medicine practices for treating mild depression, a use that has some scientific backing. Another popular remedy was valerian root, which was given to people suffering from anxiety or insomnia. Its calming effects made it a favorite among monks and healers who wanted to quiet restless minds without resorting to more extreme methods like bloodletting. Chamomile was also widely used. Brewed into teas, it was thought to help with nervous disorders and digestive issues linked to emotional distress. It wasn't just a cure. It was a form of comfort, something warm and familiar in a world full of uncertainty. But not all herbal treatments were gentle. Some were downright dangerous. Henbane, for example, was used to treat madness, but at a cost. This plant contains hallucinogenic alkaloids and can cause delirium, confusion, and even death if misused. In the wrong hands, it can make someone appear more mad than before. Mandrake root, often depicted in medieval illustrations as a human-shaped plant screaming when pulled from the ground, was believed to induce sleep and relieve pain. It was sometimes mixed with wine and given to patients undergoing surgery or simply struggling with severe mental distress. Healers also turned to lavender and rosemary, both prized for their aromatic properties. These weren't just pleasant smells. They were believed to cleanse the mind and protect against melancholy. Wealthy individuals might carry small sachets filled with these herbs, much like modern aromatherapy. Monastic infirmaries kept detailed records of herbal treatments. Some monasteries even maintained gardens dedicated to medicinal plants, carefully cultivated and documented by monks who saw healing as part of their religious duty. Despite their lack of scientific understanding, medieval herbalists did stumble upon some real solutions. Many of the plants they used contained compounds that affect brain chemistry, whether they knew it or not. However, the biggest problem remained. There was no standard dosage, no clinical trials, and no way to determine what worked for whom. What helped one person might harm another. Still, compared to being bled dry or locked away in chains, drinking a soothing herbal tea must have felt like a miracle. Now that we've explored how nature played a role in medieval mental health, let's move on to another powerful force that shaped diagnosis and treatment: religion. If medieval doctors couldn't explain a mental illness through the humors or physical imbalance, there was always one terrifying explanation left: the hand of God or the devil. In a world where religion shaped nearly every aspect of life, mental illness was often seen not as a medical condition, but as a spiritual battle. Madness wasn't just madness. It was a punishment for sin, a test of faith, or worse, demonic possession. The church taught that the soul could be corrupted by evil forces. Hallucinations, violent outbursts, depression, or even excessive joy were interpreted as signs that something unnatural had taken hold of the body. If someone heard voices, they weren't suffering from schizophrenia. They were hearing the whispers of demons. If they fell into despair, it wasn't depression. It was a failure to resist temptation. This belief created a terrifying cycle. A person showing signs of mental distress would often be brought before a priest or bishop who would determine whether their condition stemmed from divine will, human weakness, or something more sinister. One of the most feared diagnoses was demonic possession. It wasn't limited to those with severe symptoms. Anyone acting strangely, speaking incoherently, or refusing to follow religious rituals could be accused. Once labeled possessed, the only treatment available was exorcism, a dramatic and often brutal ritual meant to drive out evil spirits. Exorcisms varied in intensity. Some involved prayers, holy water, and fasting. Others escalated to beatings, starvation, or confinement in dark rooms for days. Priests believed that if the demon refused to leave peacefully, forceful methods might be necessary. But what made this belief truly dangerous was that it gave ordinary people the power to accuse others. In times of plague, famine, or war, when fear ran high, accusations of possession could spiral into mass hysteria. Entire villages might believe they were under spiritual attack, turning on neighbors, family members, and even children. Some of history's most infamous witch hunts began not with accusations of magic, but with claims of madness caused by evil spirits. Women, especially those who lived alone or showed signs of mental instability, were particularly vulnerable. Their erratic behavior was interpreted as evidence of a pact with Satan. Even monarchs weren't immune. King Charles VI of France, known as Charles the Mad, experienced episodes of psychosis so extreme that he once believed he was made entirely of glass. His court debated whether his condition was due to astrology, an imbalance of humors, or a curse from God. Religious explanations also led to another cruel practice: pilgrimage as treatment. Families would drag mentally ill relatives across Europe to visit holy sites, believing that contact with relics or saints' bones could cure them. Some returned feeling better, perhaps due to the placebo effect or simply the change of scenery. Others worsened, worn down by travel and exposure. The worst part? There was no way to prove someone wasn't possessed. If the exorcism failed, it was because the demon was strong. If the patient died, it was because they were too far gone. If they recovered, it was proof the church had saved them. This absolute control over diagnosis and treatment left little room for science, compassion, or progress. And while some monks and priests genuinely tried to help the sick, many others used these beliefs to maintain authority and suppress dissent. Now that we've explored how religion shaped the understanding of mental illness, let's move on to one of the most disturbing treatments ever devised: exorcisms and rituals to drive out demons. If medieval doctors believed the body was out of balance, they turned to bloodletting. If they thought the soul was corrupted, they turned to exorcism, a dramatic, often terrifying ritual designed to drive out demons and restore spiritual purity. Exorcisms were not just reserved for the most extreme cases. They could be performed on anyone showing signs of what we would now call mental illness: hallucinations, mood swings, violent behavior, or even excessive sadness. To medieval society, these were all symptoms of possession. The process varied depending on who conducted it. In monasteries and churches, trained priests followed formal rites based on ancient texts like the Rituale Romanum, which outlined specific prayers, gestures, and holy objects needed to cast out evil spirits. But in rural villages, exorcisms could be far more chaotic and brutal. A typical session might begin with a priest reciting prayers in Latin while holding a crucifix or holy water. The possessed individual would often be restrained, sometimes bound to a chair or bed. Others might surround them, chanting or praying loudly, believing that divine intervention could force the demon out. Holy water was frequently poured over the patient's head or face, sometimes scalding hot, in the belief that demons hated sanctified liquids. Incense filled the air as candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. In some cases, relics, bones of saints or pieces of sacred cloth, were pressed against the skin, hoping their holiness would repel the evil within. But when these methods failed, things escalated quickly. Some priests resorted to physical force, slapping or shaking the afflicted person in an attempt to shock the demon loose. Others used starvation or sensory deprivation, locking the person in dark rooms for days without food or water, believing this would weaken the demon's hold. In extreme cases, families brought their loved ones to public exorcisms, where entire crowds gathered to witness the battle between good and evil. These events were part prophecy, part theater, and part punishment. People screamed, cried, and collapsed under the pressure of expectation. There are records of individuals undergoing multiple exorcisms over weeks or months, each one more intense than the last. Some claimed to feel better afterward, perhaps due to psychological suggestion or sheer exhaustion. Others grew worse, slipping into deeper states of confusion or despair. One particularly disturbing practice involved self-exorcism. Desperate individuals, convinced they were possessed, inflicted pain on themselves, fasting, whipping their backs raw, or walking barefoot through cold streets in winter. They believed suffering would cleanse them. Women were especially vulnerable to accusations of possession. Their emotional distress, unexplained illnesses, or even simple defiance of social norms could lead to claims of demonic influence. Many witch trials began with allegations of possession before escalating into full-blown hysteria. Even children weren't spared. There are documented cases of young boys and girls being subjected to exorcisms after exhibiting strange behaviors. One 15th century case in Germany describes a 10-year-old girl who reportedly spoke in unknown languages and convulsed violently during a public exorcism attended by hundreds. The worst part? Once someone was labeled possessed, there was no easy way to prove otherwise. Priests rarely admitted failure. If the demon didn't leave, it was because the person lacked faith or because the evil was stronger than expected. This lack of accountability made exorcism both a tool of healing and a weapon of control. It reinforced religious authority, justified harsh treatment of the mentally ill, and created a cycle of fear that lasted for centuries. Now that we've seen how religion shaped diagnosis and treatment, let's take a closer look at another grim reality of medieval life: physical restraint and confinement. If medieval doctors couldn't cure madness, and religious rituals failed to drive out demons, there was always one last solution: lock the person away and hope for the best. Confinement was a common practice in the Middle Ages, not just for criminals or prisoners of war, but for anyone deemed mentally unstable. There were no psychiatric hospitals as we know them today. Instead, people suffering from what we would now call depression, schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder were often seen as dangerous, unpredictable, or even possessed. The most extreme cases were locked in cells, dungeons, or chains, sometimes for years. These weren't places of healing. They were cages. In castles and monasteries, madmen were thrown into dark pits beneath staircases or chained to stone walls. Some were left with only straw to sleep on, their meals tossed through slots like food to an animal. Even outside prisons, families dealt with mental illness by binding patients to beds or tying them to trees. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was fear. Without understanding what caused erratic behavior, people resorted to what they knew: control. In some towns, madhouses existed, not as treatment centers, but as places where the mentally ill could be kept out of sight. These early asylums were more like warehouses than hospitals. Patients were packed together in overcrowded rooms, often without light, fresh air, or basic sanitation. One of the most infamous examples was the Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, later known as Bedlam, the first institution dedicated to treating mental illness. Founded in the 13th century, it became synonymous with horror. Patients were subjected to public displays, where visitors paid to watch them scream, cry, or thrash about. It was entertainment, not medicine. But not all confinement was meant to punish. Some forms were surprisingly well-intentioned. if still deeply misguided. Monks and religious orders sometimes took in the mentally ill, offering shelter and prayer. They believed that isolation in a quiet, spiritual environment could help restore balance to the soul. However, this often meant locking individuals in small cells for months at a time, feeding them only bread and water, and hoping divine intervention would heal them. Another method involved wandering cures. Families would drag their loved ones across Europe to visit holy sites, believing that contact with relics or saints' bones could restore sanity. If this failed, the next step was often permanent confinement. Some rulers tried to take responsibility for the mentally ill. King Henry VI of England issued an order in the 15th century requiring local authorities to care for those who had lost their wits. But without funding or oversight, little changed. What made confinement so brutal wasn't just the conditions, it was the lack of hope. There was no timeline for release, no therapy, no reassurance. Once someone was labeled mad, they might never return to normal life. And yet, despite how horrifying these methods seem today, they weren't born entirely of ignorance. Medieval society faced real challenges: limited medical knowledge, scarce resources, and deep-rooted superstition. Without modern psychiatry, confinement seemed like the only way to protect both the individual and the community. Still, the psychological toll was immense. Many patients deteriorated further under isolation and neglect. Some died from starvation or disease. Others simply gave up. Now that we've explored the grim reality of restraint and isolation, let's move on to a different kind of treatment, one that relied not on force, but on sound and rhythm, music and art therapy as unusual approaches to healing the mind. In a world dominated by superstition, bloodletting, and divine punishment, it might come as a surprise that some medieval healers turned to something far gentler when treating the mentally ill: music and art. While many treatments of the time were brutal or based on fear, a few records suggest that some monks, physicians, and even nobles believed in the healing power of sound and creativity. Though not widely practiced, these methods offer a rare glimpse into a more compassionate side of medieval medicine. The idea wasn't entirely new. Ancient Greek philosophers like Pythagoras had long believed in the music of the spheres, the theory that music could influence both the body and soul. This belief carried over into medieval thought, where certain melodies were said to restore balance to the humors, especially for those suffering from melancholy or madness. Some monasteries used chanting and hymns as a form of therapy. Monks would sing Gregorian chants to calm agitated patients or help ease depression. The slow, rhythmic tones were believed to bring spiritual harmony, soothing the mind and drawing away negative thoughts. There are also accounts of musical instruments being used in treatment. Harps, lutes, and flutes were played near patients who exhibited signs of distress. In wealthy households, court musicians were sometimes summoned specifically to play for individuals showing signs of mental instability. The belief was that music could reach parts of the soul that medicine could not. Art, too, found its place in healing. Some noble families encouraged mentally ill relatives to engage in painting, embroidery, or calligraphy, believing that creative work provided structure and focus. These activities weren't seen as hobbies. They were prescribed like modern-day therapies. One fascinating example comes from the court of King Charles VI of France, known for his episodes of psychosis. During periods of lucidity, he reportedly took great pleasure in gardening, painting, and designing clothing. While this didn't cure his condition, it may have offered him moments of peace and clarity. Another unusual but documented practice involved dancing. In some rural communities, people believe that allowing the mentally ill to dance wildly during festivals or religious ceremonies could purge them of evil spirits or excess humors. While this sounds chaotic, it may have had an unintended benefit: physical exercise and emotional release. These practices were not widespread, nor were they backed by scientific understanding. But compared to exorcisms, bloodletting, and chains, they were remarkably humane. They acknowledged that the mind could be soothed, not just punished or purged. Of course, not all artistic treatments were successful. Some patients showed no improvement, while others grew more agitated. And in times of crisis, such as during plague outbreaks or witch hunts, these methods were often abandoned in favor of harsher, more spiritually approved approaches. Still, the fact that medieval society occasionally recognized the value of emotional expression, rhythm, and beauty speaks volumes. Even in the darkest ages, there were glimmers of insight into human psychology, ideas that, centuries later, would evolve into modern forms of therapy, occupational therapy, and music-assisted treatment. Now that we've explored how sound and creativity played a role in medieval mental health, let's move on to another important aspect of care: monasteries and early asylums. When medieval society struggled to understand or manage mental illness, one institution often stepped in: the monastery. Unlike prisons or dungeons, Monasteries were not places of punishment, but they weren't exactly hospitals either. Still, for those suffering from what we would now call depression, psychosis, or anxiety, a monastery might offer the only refuge available. Monks believed that spiritual devotion could heal the soul, and by extension, the mind. Many saw mental illness as a form of divine test or punishment for sin, but also as something that could be eased through prayer, fasting, and isolation from the outside world. Some monastic orders took in mentally ill individuals, offering them shelter, food, and care within the cloistered walls. These patients lived among the monks, sometimes performing simple tasks like sweeping courtyards or copying texts, though many simply rested under supervision. The treatment varied depending on the monastery. In some, patients were allowed to roam freely, participating in daily prayers and meals. In others, they were confined to small cells or kept under constant watch, especially if they showed signs of violence or self-harm. One famous example comes from the Abbey of St. Gall in present-day Switzerland, where records show that mentally ill individuals were given specific roles and treated with a surprising degree of compassion, though still within the framework of religious belief. Still, monastic care was inconsistent. Some monks genuinely tried to help their charges, while others saw them as burdens or even dangerous influences. When fear of possession or witchcraft spread, even the most charitable institutions could turn hostile. Beyond monasteries, early forms of asylums began appearing across Europe, though they bore little resemblance to modern psychiatric hospitals. The most infamous of these was Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, better known by its nickname, Bedlam. Founded in the 13th century, Bedlam became a symbol of how poorly medieval society understood and treated mental illness. Patients were housed in dark, damp rooms, often chained to the walls. They were frequently left without proper food, clothing, or medical attention. Unlike today's hospitals, Bedlam had no trained psychiatrists or therapists, only caretakers who saw their job as containment rather than healing. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Bedlam was that it became a public attraction. Visitors paid admission to wander the halls and watched the patients scream, cry, or thrash about. It was entertainment, not medicine, a grim spectacle of human suffering. Other cities followed suit, creating similar institutions where the mentally ill were locked away, often forgotten. These places were not meant for recovery. They were holding pens for those deemed too unstable or dangerous to remain in society. Despite this bleak reality, some asylum-like spaces did provide a kind of structured care. In certain cases, patients received regular meals, access to fresh air, and even limited interaction with caregivers. Compared to being exorcised, bled dry, or thrown into a dungeon, this could feel like an improvement, even if it was minimal. Over time, attitudes toward mental illness slowly began to shift. By the late Middle Ages, some scholars and physicians started questioning whether madness was always divine punishment or demonic influence. A few even suggested that mental distress could stem from natural causes, opening the door to more humane treatment. Still, progress was slow. For most people, the only options remained bloodletting, prayer, confinement, or worse. Now that we've explored how monasteries and early asylums functioned, let's take a closer look at real-life examples of mental illness in the Middle Ages. Case studies of famous historical figures whose struggles were misunderstood, mistreated, or mythologized. History is filled with powerful figures who shaped the world, but some of them struggled with mental illness in ways that changed the course of history. In the Middle Ages, madness wasn't just a personal struggle. It could determine the fate of nations. Let's look at some of the most well-documented cases of medieval mental illness and how they were misunderstood, mistreated, or even exploited. One of the most famous examples is King Charles VI of France, known as Charles the Mad. His reign was marked by periods of brilliance followed by terrifying episodes of psychosis. At times, he believed he was made entirely of glass and might shatter at any moment. During these episodes, he would refuse to sleep for fear of breaking apart. His court debated what caused his condition. Some blamed astrology, others an imbalance of humors, and still others whispered of witchcraft. Treatments included bloodletting, exorcisms, and visits to holy sites. Despite his illness, Charles ruled France for over 40 years, though many decisions were made by regents during his worst spells. Another tragic case is Isabella of Portugal, wife of Emperor Charles V. She fell into deep grief after the death of her husband, Philip the Handsome, and became convinced he was still alive. She carried his body with her for months, refusing to let it be buried. Her behavior was interpreted as madness, and she was eventually locked away in a convent for the rest of her life. Then there's Marjorie of Kemp, a 15th-century Englishwoman whose memoirs offer one of the rare first-hand accounts of mental distress in the Middle Ages. She suffered from intense emotional breakdowns, often crying uncontrollably and fearing she would burn in hell. Today, Historians believe she may have experienced postpartum depression and anxiety. Instead of medical help, she turned to pilgrimage, prayer, and confession. Monastic records also reveal stories of monks and nuns who exhibited signs of what we now recognize as obsessive-compulsive disorder, depression, and hallucinations. Some spent their days praying nonstop, while others refused to eat or sleep, believing they were unworthy of earthly comforts. In some cases, mental illness led to violence. Henry VI of England, known for his gentle nature, suffered from severe bouts of catatonia, so extreme that he would stare blankly for hours and forget who he was. During one episode, he reportedly failed to recognize his newborn son. His inability to rule contributed to the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war that reshaped England. Even among commoners, records show disturbing cases. In 13th century Germany, a group of villagers were accused of dancing wildly for weeks until they collapsed from exhaustion, a phenomenon now believed to have been mass hysteria or ergot poisoning. Known as St. Vitus dance, this event terrified local authorities, who saw it as divine punishment or demonic influence. Some individuals were labeled as prophets or saints due to their strange behavior. Joan of Arc, though not diagnosed with mental illness in her time, exhibited symptoms that today might suggest auditory hallucinations. She claimed to hear voices from God, which inspired her to lead French troops during the 100 Years' War. The English used this as evidence of possession and executed her for heresy. These real-life examples highlight how little medieval society understood about the brain. What we now know as treatable conditions were seen as curses, divine messages, or signs of weakness. And yet, despite the lack of science, people found ways to cope through faith, isolation, ritual, or sheer willpower. Now that we've explored these historical cases, let's take a closer look at how everyday people coped with mental distress in the Middle Ages, through humor, music, and simple acts of joy. In the brutal, disease-ridden, and often terrifying world of medieval life, people needed ways to cope. And while modern entertainment like streaming services, books, or video games didn't exist, medieval society found its own surprisingly creative ways to distract from suffering, and sometimes even laugh in the face of despair. Humor was not just a luxury, it was survival. In an age where death could come at any moment from plague, famine, or a random act of violence, laughter offered temporary relief. Whether it came from bawdy jokes told in taverns, crude street performances, or dark gallows humor surrounding executions, people used comedy to deal with the harshness of their reality. One of the most popular forms of entertainment was the court jester or medieval fool. These performers were more than just entertainers. They were trusted advisors, social critics, and sometimes even spies. Clad in colorful clothing and wearing bells, jesters had the rare privilege of mocking nobility without fear of immediate execution. Their jokes often contained sharp political commentary, wrapped in absurdity so that rulers wouldn't take offense, most of the time. But jesters weren't the only source of amusement. Traveling minstrels and troubadours brought music and stories to both rich and poor. They sang ballads of love, war, and tragedy, often accompanied by instruments like lutes, flutes, and drums. For peasants who spent their lives working until they dropped, these performances were moments of escape, however brief. In towns and villages, mummers' plays became a form of folk theater, often performed during festivals or religious holidays. These short, humorous plays featured stock characters like the fool, the villain, and the hero, and were full of slapstick, wordplay, and exaggerated violence. Some even included mock battles or staged deaths, which would end with a magical resurrection, offering audiences a sense of hope and control in a world where real-life endings were rarely so kind. Even public executions turned into grim spectacles. While horrifying by today's standards, these events drew massive crowds who treated them like sporting matches. People brought food, drank ale, and cheered when the condemned made a witty final statement or screamed in terror. Gallows humor flourished. Criminals were known to crack jokes before being hanged, and spectators often laughed at last words filled with irony or sarcasm. For the mentally ill or those suffering emotional distress, entertainment could provide moments of peace. Monastic records mention patients who responded positively to music or storytelling. Some monks played simple melodies on flutes or lyres to soothe agitated individuals. Others recited epic poems like Beowulf or the Song of Roland, which, while violent, offered structure, rhythm, and narrative comfort. Children, too, found joy amid hardship. Despite malnutrition and high infant mortality, kids played games like blind man's bluff, hide and seek, and jump rope, many of which are still played today. Dolls, wooden swords, and toy animals were common, showing that even in poverty, imagination thrived. Animal fights, like bear baiting or cockfighting, were also wildly popular, but not just for the bloodshed. These events created community bonding experiences. People gathered, gambled, shared food, and talked about daily struggles while watching animals fight for survival. It was cruel by modern ethics, but in a world where human life was cheap, such violence felt tragically normal. Dancing was another way people coped. During festivals like Carnival or May Day, entire towns danced in circles, celebrating fertility, spring, or religious holidays. Dancing released endorphins, reduced stress, and gave people a sense of unity. Even the mentally ill were sometimes allowed to join, offering them a rare moment of acceptance. And then there was dark humor, jokes about death, disease, and misfortune. People joked about leeches, plagues, and exorcisms long before they were subjects of history documentaries. One medieval riddle asked, "What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening?" The answer, man, was a reminder of how quickly life could deteriorate. Grim, yes, but also strangely poetic. Despite the lack of scientific understanding, medieval people instinctively knew what we now recognize through psychology. Laughter reduces stress, distraction helps manage pain, and creativity offers healing. Now that we've explored how humor and entertainment helped people survive, let's move on to one of the darkest chapters in medieval mental health history: the impact of witch hunts on perceptions of madness. The witch hunts of the Middle Ages and early modern period were not just about superstition, fear, or religious fervor. They were also deeply tied to how society understood and misunderstood mental illness. In a world where science was limited and religion ruled nearly every aspect of life, strange behavior, emotional distress, or even simple social isolation could be interpreted as signs of witchcraft. Women who lived alone, spoke out of turn, or exhibited symptoms of depression, anxiety, or psychosis were often the first to be accused. Mental illness was rarely seen as a medical condition. Instead, it was viewed through the lens of morality, sin, and supernatural forces. If someone heard voices, had visions, or acted unpredictably, they weren't suffering from schizophrenia. They were in league with the devil. This belief created a terrifying cycle. Anyone showing signs of mental instability became vulnerable to accusation. Once accused, their behavior, often worsened by fear, trauma, or torture, was taken as proof of guilt. One of the most chilling aspects of the witch hunts was how they targeted women. Many of those accused were widows, spinsters, or women who had recently lost children, people already in states of grief or psychological distress. Their symptoms, withdrawal, crying spells, erratic speech, were twisted into evidence of sorcery. Even physical conditions like epilepsy or hormonal imbalances were misinterpreted. A woman who collapsed suddenly might be said to have been overcome by demonic possession. Someone who suffered from hallucinations might be accused of summoning spirits. Once arrested, suspects were subjected to brutal interrogations. Sleep deprivation, starvation, and physical torture were used to extract confessions. In many cases, the accused truly believed they were witches by the end, either because they were broken by pain or because they internalized the accusations. Some victims may have even experienced psychosis induced by trauma, making them more likely to confess or accuse others. This led to a horrifying domino effect. Once one person confessed, they named others, creating waves of panic and persecution that could consume entire towns. One of the most infamous examples comes from the Würzburg witch trial in Germany, where over 900 people were executed between 1626 and 1631, including children as young as 8. Some of the accused showed clear signs of mental illness, but instead of receiving care, they were burned alive. The impact of these hunts extended far beyond the accused. Entire communities lived in fear of being labeled mad, or worse, a witch. People hid their emotional struggles, avoided drawing attention to themselves, and suppressed any behavior that might be seen as odd. This climate of terror affected how mental illness was perceived for centuries. It reinforced the idea that madness was dangerous, unnatural, and possibly criminal. It also discouraged families from seeking help, fearing that doing so would bring suspicion upon them. Even long after the witch hunts ended, the stigma remained. Madness continued to be associated with moral failure, weakness, or hidden evil. These beliefs shaped early psychiatric practices well into the 18th and 19th centuries, when patients were still sometimes restrained, isolated, or treated as threats rather than sufferers. What makes this history especially tragic is that many of those accused were simply struggling with what we now recognize as treatable conditions: depression, postpartum psychosis, bipolar disorder, or PTSD. With proper care, they might have lived full lives. Instead, they were silenced, sometimes violently. Now that we've explored the dark legacy of the witch hunts, let's move on to the final chapter: what we can learn from medieval approaches to mental health, and how far we've come since then. So, what can we really learn from the brutal and often terrifying world of medieval mental health? At first glance, it might seem like a dark chapter in human history, filled with bloodletting, exorcisms, and cruel confinement. But beneath the horror, there are lessons that still echo today. Medieval society didn't understand the brain the way we do now. They had no concept of neurotransmitters, no knowledge of psychology, and certainly no access to modern medicine. And yet, despite their ignorance, they tried. Whether through herbal remedies, music, or isolation, people searched for ways to help those who suffered. Some of these attempts were misguided. Others were outright dangerous. But every treatment, every ritual, and every diagnosis was rooted in one universal truth: human beings have always wanted to heal. What changed over time wasn't just science, it was compassion. Today, we know more about the brain than ever before. We've mapped its chemicals, developed medications, and created therapies that actually work. And yet, even with all this progress, stigma around mental illness still exists. People still suffer in silence. Families still struggle to find care. And sometimes, the fear of madness still leads to misunderstanding and exclusion. The medieval world teaches us what happens when we lack both knowledge and empathy. It shows us how quickly fear can turn into cruelty, and how easily superstition can fill the space where science should be. But it also reminds us that healing is not just about medicine. It's about understanding, acceptance, and community. Even in the darkest ages, some monks offered shelter. Some musicians played melodies to soothe troubled minds. Some families held on to loved ones, even when they didn't know how to help them. We may laugh at bloodletting or shake our heads at exorcisms, but the truth is, we're still figuring things out. Every generation believes it has the final answer, only to realize decades later that we were wrong about something else. And that's okay, because what matters most isn't whether we get everything right. It's whether we keep trying to understand, to improve, and to treat each other with dignity. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by the pace of modern life, remember, at least you don't have to worry about being bled dry because you're feeling sad. At least you can talk about your struggles without being accused of witchcraft. And at least if you need help, you won't be locked away. You'll be met with care. That's progress. That's humanity. And that's worth remembering. If you enjoyed this journey through history and want to see more videos like this, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and join us next time as we uncover more hidden stories from the past.